So we'll move on to Eric. The first question is quite short and simple. Is how old are you?
I'm 28.
28. It says it all. So tell us your story as a young leader, but also not only planning and delivering your project, Pass the Torch, but also mentoring and supporting other young leaders, and also the more recent experience you've had with Lausanne 2020.
Yes, of course. I mean, first, I think it's important to just go back and into my head as a young athlete going to a major sporting event. I was 17 years old, and I was training and doing everything I could to get to the Olympic Games taking place in Canada. I had a chance to compete on home soil at the Olympic Games, and I'll tell you, as a 17-year-old, I had nothing in my range of focus other than myself and my performance. Purely selfish. And I think that that's how it has to be when you're a young athlete. And many of these athletes who are competing have nothing on their minds but their own performance. But I remember walking into that opening ceremonies of the Vancouver Games and looking up and seeing 50,000 screaming Canadians and knowing the entire world was watching this event, and this event was about everybody but me. This was about the world, and this was about the power of sport. And it really inspired me to know that I had to give back to this movement that had given me so much. This platform that that was given to me allowed me to be that mentor for the next generation. And when I had the first real opportunity to work with the next generation of young athletes, it was in Lillehammer 2016 for the Youth Olympic Games. And I watched very closely as my team of Canadians walked into that opening ceremony in the bowl of the ski jump stadium in -20. It was cold, and we watched those fireworks and that Olympic flame light up just like it did in 1994. And I saw the eyes of my athletes light up just like mine had 6 years before. In the last 4 years, since 2016 to 2020, I've watched these groups come back to their communities and start doing much the same things that I did. They started going into their clubs, their schools, and their communities and started talking about the importance of their sport to them and the lessons that they are learning and continue to be able to use as they become just well-rounded people. These are community leaders. You don't need to say, there's not much convincing required, like Kate said, that they want to be out there, they want to be working in their communities, and they want to be giving back to a sport that's given them so much. So, I mean, it's really interesting to talk about how these young people are able to be empowered. Like, what does that really mean, to be empowered? I mean, one thing, when you're arriving at a sports competition, of course you're empowered. You are there to be your best self and be very, efficient at what you do, but you also have the opportunity to have your voice heard. And I think that's a really important thing for young people to do, is just be available, like have other people, powerful people who can have the authority to break down the barriers and give them a chance, listening to them. And that's something that I've been able to help facilitate in my role going forward.
And in the framework of this summit, we're talking about the SDG framework and the Agenda 2030. Mm-hmm. How convincing and telling and relevant is that for young leaders when you say they don't require much convincing to give back and get involved? Yeah. But does this framework speak to them? Are they comfortable bringing it into action somehow?
So I think that that's where we need to have a bridge. To be fair, we need a bridge there, because there is this group needs to have some kind of mentorship to get from a motivated young athlete who wants to give back to their community and the tools along the way that allow it to work into this framework that is so critical for the world going forward. I think that one of the things that I've been able to do is help be that connection between, because I'm in a mentorship group with the IOC Young Leaders now, and some of them have tuned in to watch, so thank you for joining, everyone. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And whether it be small questions like how can I prepare my cash flow budget to make sure this program operates effectively, or whether it's I just can't figure out how to get this person's attention at my national federation. What's going to work? How can I convince them that this is really important to not just me personally as an athlete, but to you and your organization and you in sport? I think that those little pieces are important to help steer the conversation from just an athlete who wants to give back to their community and an athlete who can be really valuable in terms of the global movement.
As an athlete, you probably had a very vague idea of what the IOC was about, and even that the headquarters was in Lausanne, probably. How did you react when you got the invitation to join the Young Leader program in the first place?
It's a great point. I remember there was an application that went out and we were looking for people to help lead a team, and I really thought that it was that next step that I could do to give back to the sporting world. And of course I said yes. And who knew that 4 years later we would be sitting here today talking on this panel. And I think that it's been, when I first was invited, it was just really important moment because for the first time I was invited to be part of the process. And I think that's a really important thing. Young people need to be just given that opportunity to be giving back and using their skills. And I'll say that, I mean, right now we're sitting on a panel and we're talking about youth in sport, but I think we need to go beyond that. I think that youth have an important voice to play on all of the panels happening at this event and at many others.
And one particular voice from youth that we've heard over the last couple of years is related to climate.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the experience and your encounters with a group of activists in January as you were here in Lausanne for the Youth Olympic Games?
Yes, so it was a really interesting story, Philippe. I had a great experience because I have the pleasure to sit on the IOC Culture and Olympic Heritage Commission, and I was put on that place by IOC President Thomas Bach. And one of the things we got to do is we got to come see the Youth Olympic Games taking place here in Lausanne in January. And what a moment. We sit, suited up in the boardrooms, and we are young people with, like Kate said, presidents of international federations, and we are talking about the strategy of the IOC going forward. Very, very nice position to be in for a young person, to be honest. But then, just the next day, I'm watching 15,000 young people march in the streets of Lausanne for climate justice. And we have young activists who want to have their voice heard. And I think the IOC was very forward-looking, and they invited 5 of them to come speak at the Youth Olympic Village. And I was one of the people who was privileged to be able to host them in this event. And the 5 of us, young green activists from Switzerland. Greta Thunberg was not there on that day, but she was in the crowd of 15,000 who was marching outside the Olympic Village. And we came in and we started to have a conversation between these young activists and the young athletes who were at the games. And Kate, we can talk about this too, because one thing that we noticed was that it wasn't just this is the green young activists and this is the young athletes who are focused on sport. These were issues that the entire generation was concerned about. There were young skiers and snowboarders who had watched in front of their eyes their ski hills melt away and snow not come back as it had for 50 years before that. And it was like a shared perspective of young people and what they brought to the conversation. On the last panel, it was a really interesting point about risk identification. And that's one thing that we look at a lot now. When we're trying to spot trends and identify risks going forward, how could you exclude the perspectives and insight of young people who live it every single day? And so that was just one example of an experience where I saw firsthand young people being invited in to have their voice heard at an event, at a sporting event. And from that, we were able to learn that this is an important factor for not just activists in the streets, but also athletes who were invited to participate in the games.
Eric, there are so many barriers to sports, especially now with the current pandemic. Mm-hmm. And doing sports and enjoying the benefits of physical activity is and should be a human right, especially for children. Would you love to see, or would you expect in the coming years to see sports activists, young people, really pushing for more accessibility to sports in the cityscape, in different parts of the world, especially for vulnerable pockets of population? Do you see something coming up here?
Well, I think that it's absolutely true that we've seen how effective large activations of young people can be in delivering what they want. I wouldn't be surprised if we see young people coming forward and saying, like, we demand this active transportation to get to where we want to go. We don't want to be stuck in the traditional ways to school. I was at an excellent event in Shenzhen, China in November last year, and we were talking about different ways to create accessible transportation for young people. And there were great ideas coming out of my colleagues who were there, and they were diverse and they were interesting. And one of them was actually a mobile bus system. So what it was like Uber, but instead of having a ride pick you up, it was for parents to have their kids walk to school together. So you'd have one person leading the bus, the walking bus, and you'd register your child and they'd be picked up by the walking tour, and then they'd all walk to school together. And it was just like a really interesting tech solution that was developed to help get people more active. And I think that when you get both the business side and the clear benefits of young people being more active together, you have really interesting solutions coming in the future, I hope. And
the good news is that we have Pedibus. It's
yes.
been going on for 20 years.
Yes.
Exactly.
Eric, anything else to say about Pass the Torch, the lessons learned, and how you share the passion and give back also through the next generation of young leaders? Mm-hmm. Did you want to add anything on that experience?
Well, truly, it was one of the most rewarding things working with my team now. Maggie and Taylor, they've been the the ones picking up this program and working with it in Canada. And it's impressive to see their new idea, their spark going forward. But I think that we all need to, we all have earned our place to talk about sport. Anyone who's been part of a sport and is part of developing a program has earned their space there, and it's important to continue to empower and capacity build for those who come next. And I think that we need to be really strategic about who we build this capacity into, because we need a diverse and inclusive sporting world, so it's going to be most effective. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is being able to make sure that everyone is always included in these conversations. I mean, we have regional group calls where, I'm working with projects from around the world. And for example, like a lot of our participants are working in countries that don't have excellent broadband internet. So when I jump on my call and we have our Zoom, like bam, you got HD video of my face right there, easy. But it's not always the case for everyone who's trying to tune in and be networked. And so simply saying things, and I've said them a few more times before they really get traction, is like, let's make sure there's a local dial-in number. So if somebody can't call in with this broadband, we make sure that it's accessible for them to get in. And I think just like having that awareness to not everyone is working with the same reality is really important when we're trying to have these projects that go further than just our very local communities. When we want to build on each other's competencies, we need to make sure it's accessible and inclusive.
Thank you very much, Eric. Wonderful messages for city leaders listening in. Listen to your youth. Don't just listen, but give them the toolbox and trust them. And in some cases, take risks. Yep. Because they got to learn, but you need to mentor them and entrust them as far as you can. So thanks very much for sharing your passion.